Hey everybody, and welcome to the Rabbit Trail Podcast. We are on episode number 112. And yes, 112, we're all the way up there. And so we're excited that you're joining with us today. Thank you for jumping on a line to jump in or listening on the podcast. This is a podcast where basically we want to chase the truth wherever it runs. And that means for us, we're jumping after the sermons that were going on at Olive Branch Community Church on Sundays and kind of diving in deeper. Now, you may be listening to this for the first time. You might be joining us and just checking things out because you were curious. You saw it maybe on a billboard or something like that. Well, first of all, we just want to welcome you. Thank you for giving us a chance and checking in. And we're just excited that you would be a part of this conversation, or at least listening in, because we really desire to kind of go deep into the questions people have about the Bible, not just say everything we can at a sermon, but there gives opportunity to kind of unload other pieces. By the way, my name is Greg Harris. I'm the senior pastor at Olive Branch. Glad that you would join us. And my co-hosts who were here last week, and I wasn't, are, hey guys.
Stephen Oldham, the local outreach coordinator here, and that's just for the record, it's 112, right?
That's what I said.
Okay, 112.
We don't need to worry about that anymore.
Oh, okay.
It could be 112. That's also how we say it colloquially, right?
That's how we say it colloquially.
What we're saying
you can't say colloquially.
It is a buttload of episodes.
I don't.
A buttload? Is that like half
just
a,
makes
like
me
a baker's
think of
dozen?
The quote. I just love that quote. So anyway.
Well,
a baker's wait, no, 112. That's a lot.
It is
but
a lot.
Okay. What are you going to say when we're like 200? Is that like two buttloads? We're kind of getting far afield here.
Yeah.
My name is Stephen, the local outreach coordinator. No, thank you guys for listening. If you did catch us on YouTube and you're watching this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe and like the channel. And, if you have a question, you can send us a question in the chat, but just make sure it's in the form of a question. But it's better to send it to the email. I will say that.
Trebek?
Yeah. Well, I think it's like a statement is not a question.
Is the Rabbit Trail.
So feel free to make as many statements as you'd like. They're nice. Some of them are great. But I don't get a lot of people do get offended at statements. I'm not one of these people who gets offended. It's something touched you.
I think actually the more I've watched you read statements, it's not so much that you get offended. You just get plain old confused.
Yes. Yeah. I'm kind of curious as to what prompted the question more than I am what the question is actually saying. I'm like, okay.
You're taking your psychologist counseling
Yeah.
and you're like, that's a trigger there. I wonder what happened in their history that made them want to be triggered by that particular thing. What was their teacher? What was the preaching? How did that go?
You're driving. It's like driving. Like do say, it's like I don't know which one of you said it or what. It is like someone driving by in a car going, I like that very much, or I hate that. You guys suck, or whatever. It was like, okay. Yeah, I don't know.
That's how I view the internet. It's like people driving down, they just pick up a quick glimpse of what you're listening to, and they're like either holding a sign up like "boo" or "yay," and you're like, oh, "Sweet, lots of people are saying yay to me."
I'm just glad to be a part of the conversation.
What's funny too is like this culture today. Just like people get so offended over somebody's opinion or their statement.
I'm offended by that.
Yeah, and then Jacob, who kind of helps produce the show. He gets access to all the statements. And so one day we were all sitting here and he was just like, oh, I don't want to read that statement. And we were like, no, what's it say? And he starts reading off all these horrible statements that people are making toward us. And we're laughing. And Jacob just could not understand how we thought that was funny and weren't like completely offended and hurt
because
by these statements.
I think we just know that your statements say far more about you than it says about us.
Yeah, that's true.
It is funny. You don't know who's saying them, and you don't know the person that's.
Now we've made a bunch of paranoid people in statements.
So
keep your comments coming,
or keep them to yourself. I don't know which one are we saying. So
we're not bothered by your statements. Just make honest statements.
Sure.
So. And again, your questions at rabbittrail@obcc.church.
What was that again?
Rabbittrail@obcc.church. And we have a full schedule today. We have horrible jokes and we have questions. Oh, we got a question. So stay tuned through the whole show because we have a full plate today.
And now it's time for Brent and his horrible jokes.
Ding. All right, so who was the shortest person in the Old Testament? And just to preface it, it wasn't Nehemiah.
Yeah, it was
So who was?
Bildad the Shuhite.
Boom! Chakalaka. There we go. Okay, and who was the smallest person in the New Testament?
Well, Zacchaeus was a wee little man. I'm just kidding.
It was Peter. He slept on his watch. He slept on his watch.
Wow, that has so many dimensions to it that
Boom, chakalaka.
If you like these jokes, you're really going to like the play we're going to be doing here in a few months.
Really?
The dad jokes. It's like a play of dad
it's
jokes.
a dad jokes
I'm gonna
play.
say
It's
That's
kind
pretty
of,
good.
yeah.
I'm going to say flat
These-
out. If
these
you
kinda
like
humor.
these jokes, then we have some pretty insulting statements to make to you.
The beginning.
The big
In the
inning,
beginning.
Ah.
In the beginning.
All right.
In the beginning.
In the beginning.
So-
Beginning.
So again,
In the
this was
beginning.
we are in the series. Oh no, we weren't. This was a standalone.
This is a
This
standalone.
bridge
It's Palm
between
Sunday.
the last series and Easter.
This is
It was
Holy
the Palm
Week
Sunday
right now.
service.
Yeah. All over the world.
The topic was the right response to a king, and so one of the things you talked about was. And I don't have it written. Jesus will ask us to do unreasonable and uncomfortable things was one of the statements you made, and you were talking about prophets running around naked or whatnot, and so a lot of people were like, "What?" But just really quickly, just kind of, what are some of the weird things that God has asked His people to do or the prophets to do that just would like make people shake their head and go, "What?"
Some of the weird things he's asked his people to do, or just the
or his
prophets.
Whatever.
Well, I mean, we've got like obviously Hosea is asked to marry a prostitute.
Gomer.
Yeah. And just like, hey, she's sleeping around with people. Go marry that girl. Oh, which is like really salacious in the ancient world. That's not like something you did. You got Isaiah is told, I think it's Isaiah who's supposed to walk around naked for like several, almost
Isaiah.
years, right? It's like a long time. Poor guy had probably a horrible sunburn. And then Ezekiel is told to lay on his side for like almost a whole year, like 360 or 390 days, maybe over a year. And then he's supposed to make, special bread that we now eat today. No.
Ezekiel's bread.
You want to talk about the Ezekiel bread for a second here?
We can talk about it.
It's so funny because the actual Ezekiel bread
In the Bible.
he's told, hey, I want you to make this bread, and then I want you to cook it over human poop.
Ooh.
Speaking of butler.
It's all natural.
Yum.
I mean, just sorry. All the ladies are like turning it off from our comments.
Hey, this is in the Bible.
So yeah. So anyway,
All the ladies are going, "That's disgusting." I'm turning it off, and all the guys are saying, "Ooh, is that where popcorn came from?" Oh no. Sorry.
Anyway, so we got this issue here where he's like, I've never eaten anything undefiled. So God goes, okay, fine. You can just cook it over some cow dung. That's good. And I love how like the Bible's so careful on how it states it's dung, human dung, not it doesn't use the word poo. Anyway,
I will say though, cow dung does smell a lot better than human dung.
Oh gosh,
I will say that.
Are you a connoisseur?
I am a connoisseur. Horse dung is the best smelling dung.
I've been on trails where horse dung is. I've been out in pasture. Been into Norco where there's cow.
You thought
smell.
the scabs
And I've been to
conversation
San
was bad.
Francisco where there was plenty of human feces all over the place,
Oh.
and it was just disgusting. So yes, I agree with you, Brent.
Thank you.
The smells are radically different. But yeah, so that would be to him. You got any of them, Stephen, that you found?
Ezekiel shaves his head and his beard. That's kind of weird.
And then he's like lets them blow away in the wind, and he's supposed to build a small little
it's a fire
model of the temple. I guess it's the temple or of Jerusalem, and then he attacks it. He's like
he builds a little model and smashes it. Yeah, that's right.
It's kind of that's kind of fun. Hey, play with the toys, boys. Okay.
Yeah. That was one of the first references of Legos in Scripture. So, build something and destroy it.
Did Jeremiah instructed to bury a linen belt? That would have been part of it.
Yeah, well, he was also instructed that is, your wife's going to die, and now you're not to cry at all. And you're just like,
wow,
ow, that's horrible. That's just not happy. So yeah, the prophets are asked to do some pretty pretty crazy things.
Yeah.
Like, hey, go to Nineveh and go preach to a bunch of people who fillet you for fun and strip you down and put your skull in.
Now, your wife is going to die,
castles.
and I don't want you to cry. And I mean, translated in the original language, that wasn't, and I don't want any tears of joy, right? Just to clarify, this was...
You're really going to have to help.
I'm in a bad way today. I've
understand
been sitting in front of my computer all day today,
Yeah.
and I just have not really had much of a chance to have an outlet. And so
did Nancy send you like some bad emails or something?
No.
Did you eat Ezekiel bread?
Huh? Yeah, I do.
No comments. I guess they're not a sponsor anymore.
So,
sorry.
yes. And by the way, I just got a text from Debbie. She said, here's a joke from Paul in the 4th grade. Why do you not want to give chickens marshmallows? Because they'll just peep all over the place. Peeps. That was cute.
That was in the moment, people. That was an in the moment joke.
This is a podcast that's live on.
This is a rabbit trail.
Yes,
is what this is.
But yeah, there's all kinds of these things. You mentioned it in your sermon, right?
A couple of them.
What was your main point for mentioning all the weird things from the Old Testament?
Well, my thing is, like, today I think a lot of Christians would believe that
God asking them to do something weird.
Yeah, they would say, no way God wouldn't ask me to do something weird. He wouldn't ask me to go down and go stand with a sign on a street corner and shout like, Jesus loves you, or, and yet there are a lot of these people who said, no, I feel like God was, calling me to do this. There's a lot of people who we know God calls them to do lesser things, like, hey, go invite your neighbors to church on Easter. And we go, I don't want to do that. That's weird.
House and put a door hanger on their doorknob.
And I think what's happened is our culture has made religious things more and more odd. And so the more basic things have become even more difficult. We think, oh, that's weird. Like, I wouldn't pray in a board meeting. Like, what? That's weird. I wouldn't reference a Bible verse. I used to tell people all the time, if you're ever going to reference a Bible verse, you don't have to do it that way. Just say, hey,
citation in
ancient wisdom. There's some really cool ancient Jewish wisdom that I know, and I kind of share with you, because that's like saying I got this ancient Buddhist wisdom. You're like,
Confucius say,
yeah. And it's like, when you just got some really cool ancient Jewish wisdom. So you say it that way, people are like, oh wow, that's really cool. You're just quoting Jesus.
But then you say that's from the Bible, and they go, I hate it.
Yes. But
how dare you?
But you see, like, we got to be cagey about things sometimes, and it's like, actually, I think that's the enemy playing some games with us and believing that, that's, again, I think comfort creeping in over every command God gives us is in some way either odd or uncomfortable.
Don't you think part of that, though, is because our culture practices politeness sometimes over the ability to have to say something harsh and truthful?
Oh, yeah, just like you guys were talking about last week, where we don't think of love as this concept of where I need to tell you something difficult because I love you. It's gentle parenting, whatever stuff that's going on, where it's like, no,
well,
kids are always right. And
I don't know what your parents did, but I remember one time I threatened to move out, and I got my bags packed and put out in the front house. And boy, did that teach me that there are consequences to the oh, you want to leave? Oh, okay, well, let's just pack your bags up. And you start putting them. No, you wanted to leave. I'm just giving you what you like. No, I like it here. It's great. It's a wonderful place to live.
Called my bluff. I'm sorry.
But the idea of someone doing that, oh my gosh, that's so cruel. Like, what are you saying? Like,
I did that to my sons.
Yeah, like, I don't find that to be cruel. I found that to be a loving act of telling me how much I value the roof over my head. Now I see the value of that. As a kid, you might not. I don't think of it as cruel. What would happen to me?
Showing you the end of the disrespect that you're proclaiming. It's like we even at one point, I think we left. My kids were like, "Well, we want to stay at the park." And we're like, "Okay," and we just walked to the car, got in the car, and literally pulled back and went far enough to where they thought we were going, and they all were like, "Wah!" freaking out. It's like they were going to be fine. They were safe. We weren't going to leave them, but we were definitely going to make them think twice. It's like, you don't, like, guys, you don't want to be here alone. We need to go, kind of stuff. And I just think sometimes God does that too with us,
I think it irks people to think that might be the most loving way to teach somebody a thing. I don't know. I just think that oftentimes you don't get the point across sometimes. I think that's what's going on in the Old Testament. I think God is like, I have done everything I possibly can. This is the end of the road. I want to show you what the consequences of your actions are going to bring.
I was laughing about something like this the other day. I was sitting downstairs talking to the teachers at the school. Yeah, I guess they were having some problem with one of these kids, and it's been like, he keeps like throwing, like, I think it was like bread or something else at other kids, and it was like, and there's like, oh, yeah, well, I guess we gotta put him in, separate him, put him time, all this kind of conversation. I was just like, wow, if it was all just like dudes, like, I mean, I'm like men, but like dudes running a church, what we do? We'd be like, all right, you like throwing that stuff at people? Come here, stand here. Everybody, you get some. Throw it at them. Go ahead. Toss it. Throw it as hard as you can. Water bottle. Yeah. And like, how does it feel? Does it feel good? Yeah. This is what you want to do. And people be like, oh, that's horrible. That's children. It's like,
that's how we grew up.
Yeah. You can tell we didn't grow up in this generation. Yeah. No trophies for me.
I remember.
Unless you won.
I mean, just kind of playing off that. I just remember, as a kid and you're in trouble and you start crying and your dad starts taking off his belt. I'll give you something to cry about. Well, Dad, obviously I have something to cry about. I'm crying.
Yeah. I don't need any more. I'm good.
Exactly.
I mean, we're not advocating child abuse, obviously.
No, not at all. No, not at all.
You are?
No, we're not.
Oh, no.
No, we're not.
Oh, okay.
I just can't tell when you're joking sometimes.
Yes. So. I am.
No, yeah. I mean, but I do think that sometimes.
I mean, I am saying that, nobody believes in child abuse until you have children. And then you understand it. But you still don't, practice it, right? I am so on the edge today.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get us in trouble.
Gonna get an E rating.
I am, but
the comments of Brent
keep
are not
in
all
mind,
the comments
everybody,
of all.
I'm just joking most of the time, more or less.
No, I mean, I just think of the things that people do with their kids and stuff, and people outside of that environment would think odd of that conversation. So I do feel like the Bible is in a conversation that you need to know about, that get the context to really see. Like people would think if you were sitting out with the neighbors and you saw the mom open the door and put the suitcase out there, you might have a whole different picture of what's going on in the family than what's really going on the inside of the story. Yeah, that's what I think about the Bible.
I also think there's a major assumption people are making if they're offended by this kind of stuff in the Bible, that they're assuming that their lifestyle is not the offensive lifestyle. Just because you live in the modern times where this is okay for you, we have that, chronological snubbery that Lewis talks about. It's like, how do you not know that their way wasn't better? Isn't it just it's a different time, it's a different age, and you're just assuming your cultural mode is the better way? And isn't that just hubris and arrogance on your part? And so it's like, can we pause for a minute and consider maybe the other ways might be better? Maybe we don't have it all figured out just because I know how to use a smartphone,
But we also, I think, we live in a culture that has made everything uncomfortable now, right? I mean, we're talking about.
You mean make everything a discomfort? Make everything a discomfort to myself. Yeah.
Everything is uncomfortable now.
Yeah.
I mean, you second guess yourself. You don't, like this. We've got to ask you to do something unreasonable or uncomfortable, and I get uncomfortable now even doing good things. I mean, like I remember just a few weeks ago there was a woman in front of me in line at Cerrito Brothers, and she was talking to the cashier. The cashier was kind of like, I haven't seen you, and she was like, I'm getting treatment for some medical issue or whatever, and I kind of felt this urging inside to just go, after they were done with their conversation, just going, you know what? What's your name? Because I just want to be praying for you as you are, coming out of this or whatever. And I just like, oh, that would be so weird to say that to her, and especially part of the male-female thing. Or there's been so many times that you're watching this older woman unloading, big old water bottles, into their car from the grocery store or Sam's Club, and you just want to stop and go, you know what? Can I load those in your car for you? And it's always like, yeah, no, I feel like that's almost so inappropriate to, not inappropriate, but it's like they're going to think that you're,
Well, then there's all that craziness going on in gyms and.
Well, yeah. Well, right now in gyms, there's so many people that are, that have got their camera out in a gym and they're using this to get clicks on, like women on YouTube. And what they'll do is they'll pretend like they're lifting weights, and then someone will go, hey, can I help you? And they go, you're sexist or whatever. And so they have videos of the opposite where a woman gets stuck and guys just walk by and let her get stuck there. She can't lift the weights and she's holding on to it. So this has messed up all the etiquette in gyms. Not that they always had good etiquette, but still now people don't want to get involved because they figure I might get sued or I might get accused on social media of being a bigot or a homophobe
but
or
part
something.
Of me too, it's just all the dangers, all the creeps out there, all the abductions and stuff. So if I was a woman by myself unloading heavy water bottles into my car and some strange guy walked up and said, can I help you? I would almost be like of the mindset of what's his ulterior motive? Am I in danger?
Well,
And
that's what's hard.
It makes you uncomfortable doing kind things.
It's a similar thing to like we just went out and we tried to invite people to come to church, right? And I run in, there's some good things, but you run into some hostile people, and I'm always kind of like, I just want to like stop them and go like, look, I'm just giving you, like I'm inviting you to a free concert. Like there's free music, you get to go, and then you get a free TED Talk that can actually apply to your life and help you out if you want to take it or not. You don't have, and you get to come, and we'll give you free donuts and free coffee. I'm literally inviting you to be a guest, an amazing opportunity, and you're like, oh, how dare you invite me to your church? And you're like,
how rude.
I know. It's like, that's not rude. Like, I just invited you to a party that you don't even know that exists right around your corner. You can come to every day. It's like, to me, I'm just like, it's the context is just so weird.
We do live in a very upside down world, which kind of goes to that next thing too. Is we're being Palm Sunday, we were talking about the triumphal entry, right? And I mean, people are throwing down their cloaks and palm leaves as Jesus is riding the donkey and they're celebrating and they're singing Hosanna and they're singing praises and honoring him as the Messiah coming into the town on Palm Sunday, and then 5 days later...
They didn't call Palm Sunday back then.
Yeah, no, they didn't. No, they called it Cloak Sunday. And then Friday, 5 days later, they're screaming, crucify him, crucify him. What a quick turn of events, number one. So kind of a question, and I think this was Nate's question as well, so it's nice to know that me and an 18-year-old are aligned in thought and theology, is just... were these the same people, when it's talking about the crowds cheering and singing his praises as he's coming in and the crowds shouting for his crucifixion? Is this the same crowd or is this a different crowd? He had his followers that stuck with him, and then religious leaders and their sect were the ones crucifying him. Or did everybody really turn that quickly just a few days later? And if they change that quickly, what are some examples of that, in history or even recent history that you guys can think of where people flip that quick?
Well, there's a lot of psychology on the psychology of crowds. I mean, there's been a lot of research on just what makes people want to get involved or not get involved, or they've even had whole crowds ignore someone in need and just watch them get hurt, even though they had the means to stop because of some social pressures. Mm-hmm. So I know one thing from reading some of the literature is that people do different things in crowds than they would individually. Mm. And so sometimes it's hard to get a crowd to respond a certain way, especially if you've already rallied them. And they've done enough studies to know that like we are heavily influenced by a crowd. Like we don't like to think that, but they'll do studies like they'll put a group of people in a room and all of them will stand up at a certain time and then they'll sit down. And so someone will come in new to the room, doesn't know what's going on. They'll sit in the chairs and everybody stands up and then that person stands up and then they all sit down and then that person sits down. Like they would never do that. Like they don't, no one's asked. So just the idea that if everyone's doing a thing, you feel like you need to do that thing. And so oftentimes we don't like that, but I've noticed that we are very susceptible to crowds. But the Bible does use crowds to represent things.
Yeah. In fact, if you kind of do a study through the word oklos, which means crowd, it's oftentimes just saying this is a representation of the people, like it represents kind of like Israel. So when you get into the conversation about the crowd, yeah, you have these people who are shouting and cheering that Jesus is, the Messiah coming in. Obviously, the Pharisees aren't shouting and cheering. They're like, be quiet, be quiet. So you have your naysayers in the group. And then he goes into the temple. He doesn't do anything and leaves. Now you're the crowd. And you're expecting Jesus to now step into the temple. He's the Messiah, proclaim himself, do these things. And he walks up to the temple, looks around, walks away. I mean, as the crowd, you're kind of like,
that was anticlimactic.
That wasn't what I thought was going to happen. Wait a minute. Where are the swords? Where's the, why isn't he marching up and making a big proclamation? Why isn't God? I bet there was some sense that the crowd felt a little deflated at the end of the big thing. Then he comes in the next day and people are like, oh, maybe it's today. And he's like, whipping and cleansing this temple and like pushing away all the leadership that they honored. Like this would be like Jesus showing up and getting on all the pastors. Like
I don't think that means what you think it means.
Pastors conference, right? It would be like we love these pastors, we love these teachers, we love these people. These are the people that we respect, and they teach us and they guide us, and like they're the good ones. If they're the good ones and he kicks them out, what does that mean to us? You know, and I think there was a lot of, because Jesus starts getting more and more vocal and a bit more, I would say, more radical as he's
like, when he's cleaning out the temple, he's quoting Old Testament prophets.
And he's telling them who's going to inherit and who's not. And he's just really drawing hard lines. And I think the crowd is watching, getting more and more confused. Like, what do we mean by this? What's going on here? Like, and now they know they could be kicked out of their synagogues if they're caught following, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees are going to do that. So there's a lot of tension that is happening in the text, when suddenly now Judas apparently cheering on day one and betraying him. Who else do you think felt deflated? Who else do you think was like, this isn't what's supposed to happen? This is ridiculous. I'm out. This is dumb. This guy's a fake. And I think that's kind of what happened to Judas. He came to the fact that he thought, this is a fake. I got duped. What do you want me to give him to you guys? Like, this is dumb. And so it's not surprising, I think, that by the time you got to remember, this is not just any old crowd. They've taken him by night in secret, arrested him, brought him out, putting him out there. And the crowds have gathered, but it's a specific kind of crowd now before Pilate. They're going to be shouting about, they're going to be more of the deeper religious people, because they're all for Barabbas getting out. And he was this, in their mind, this freedom fighter.
But pro-Pharisee.
Yeah, and they're all pro-Pharisee or Sadducee even. They're definitely going to be like, we're not going against the Sanhedrin. And Rome, we don't want to go against Rome. Like, he didn't do anything. Like, wow, he's going to get crucified. I think the crowd mentality takes over. And so they're like, absolutely, crucify him. Like, get this fake out of here. This is dumb. Like, we're done. And I think that's kind of what happened with the crowd mentality. It just didn't manifest what they thought it was. And so the crowd, if you don't give the crowd what they want, they often turn against you. That's kind of at least that seems to be some of the stuff that we see. Mm-hmm. So where does this happen in life? Like, that was your other question?
Yeah, I mean, what are some other examples of people turning that quickly, or
Well, the one I remember is World War II. After World War II, Churchill gets kicked out as being the prime minister after winning World War II. Mm. And they turned on him. They did not like his politics. And so he's the greatest hero, giving speeches. They're just rallies, people screaming. And within a few years, he's no longer the prime minister. So it's like crowds can really turn, especially after a war. But also just like any kind of political movement, once you have little information at the front, and then later on you get all the information, people kind of rewrite history. And I thought I saw this with COVID. Everybody was like not sure whether they should take the vax and not take the vax. But now you talk to people and they seem like they knew right from the beginning everything that was going on. And clearly I remember being there and being just as confused as everyone else. But now that we've seen it be what it is, or however you feel about it one way or the other, we now have definite opinions. And sometimes you can even rewrite what you were doing in the crowd at the time. And so I do see that, like, as a person, when I study more psychology, that I am way more susceptible to groupthink, because I'm meant to be living in a community than I want to appear. And so you do have the ability to switch. You ever been in a room where you like held this person? You're like, I never held this person, but now I'm in this room, and that makes a lot of sense. And then the other group of people come in and tell you that, and you go like, wait a minute, now that makes sense. Yeah. And you're kind of like, you're not necessarily strong on the subject, but they need you to make a decision. And so this has happened a lot with politicians. They can play on your lack of information to get you into your emotions really quick. And that was like one of my favorite scenes from a movie, from a play called Richard Rd. There's all these people, Richard's trying to take over the kingdom, and he's got all his men around, and they're in a group. And one guy he knows totally disagrees with him, but he knows everyone agrees with that guy because they trust him. And he comes in and he just says like, oh my gosh, he accuses him of this thing. You did this terrible thing to me. And they're like, oh man, if he must have done that thing. And so the entire group gets up and joins the king against the one guy, and the guy barely said anything. And they killed that guy. And it was just like, he's sitting there going, how did this happen? And he turned the whole table using an emotion. and very little thought and very little time. And so if I can get you to not think really quickly and motivate your emotions, it's easy to manipulate a crowd.
Well, I think of a modern thing that's happening right now. I mean, how many people jumped on board the Kanye West transformation only to now be completely disappointed, you know? And how many young men or women who have, like, they ran to be a part of it, a part of Christianity because Kanye made it cool for a hot minute, are now like gonna walk away completely because they follow Kanye, they don't follow Jesus. And so that's like that's an example to me of like, you gotta be, why are you following Jesus? Like, what were you wanting out of it? The crowd is a movement of desire, and when you don't get what you desire, you're gonna go against whatever it was. And just like some of the statements Kanye has been making lately is like very anti Jesus in a lot of ways, and you're just like, or at least anti the church. And so to me, it's just, you can see that in a lot of celebrity movements, a lot of Instagram followers who are like, oh, I love Jesus, and they just deconstruct, like, and it's crazy. Like there's some of them that have been very famous for deconstructing, getting divorced and all these kinds of things, and yet they still try to put themselves out there as like, hey, see, I'm famous, see, I know how to have a relationship even when we're divorced. And I always thought that was weird, because I'm like, then if you've got this good relationship with your ex-husband after you're divorced, why'd you get divorced? Just work on your marriage.
Right. You know, and I mean, one of the things too that you kind of brought up before we started recording was, you know, in Exodus too, where, you know, Moses goes up the mountain and they start building an idol and worshiping that, you know. And it's just like, hey, I'm going to go talk to God again. I'll be right back. And it's like, okay, in your absence, we're going to worship this golden calf. And and it's just like how quickly we do, flip, especially when the crowd is perpetuating it. And you were talking about, you know, mentioned Conway now, speaking out against the church. Kanye.
Who's Conway?
What did I say?
Conway.
Bob Conway.
Oh, yeah. No, Tim Conway.
He's
Conway. Funny. He's funny.
Junior
Carol
or
Burnett's
senior?
show, you know. Just
senior.
Go back to the old days. Apple Dumpling Gang. But you were talking about him talking negative about the church, and I do feel like in a lot of areas it is like fashionable now to really bag on the church, you know. Just talk about how bad the church is.
It's been that way it's been that way for the church community.
And then when you're like trying to reason with them, they're like, "Well, Jesus did it, you know, Jesus." And I'm like, "No, you know, I mean, number one, the church wasn't even there till Jesus died and rose again." But you know, he spoke against the hypocrisy. You know, he didn't dismantle the temple.
He actually was speaking to those who should have known that he was the Messiah and didn't. So he would be speaking to Christians who are bagging on the church. They would be the ones that he'd be speaking to. Like, it's not the church he would be speaking to. If the church is trying to be faithful and follow Jesus, yeah, they're going to make mistakes. Look at Revelation. What does he do to the churches? Yes, he rebukes them, and he challenges them to come back and put themselves back together. But if you were to equate a Pharisee with anybody, it would be that Christian who thinks that they know better than the church, and so they're not even aware that they're ignoring what is truth in their face, right? That's what the Pharisees were. They were ignoring Jesus as the Messiah. And so he's rebuking them because they should know better, but they don't. Right. So, I mean, sorry.
And one thing,
I mean,
one of the things, and I usually share it in the membership class too, is, you know, one of the things, like Kevin Kane, you know, as a missionary pastor, and he would teach at Biola, he would teach at Cal Baptist. One of the things he would do, and this is going to sound weird and uncomfortable, but you know, he would introduce his wife to the class, and then when she left, you know, we've been married for 46 years, and he would kind of start, you know, making comments like, you know, wow, when we married, you know, she was hot, you know, her hair's thin, she's got some wrinkles, some dents in her fender, you know, whatever, until the class looks like they're uncomfortable. And he's like, do you feel like that's wrong of me to say those things? And they're like, well, yeah. And he's like, listen, there's nobody that thinks my wife is more beautiful than I do, and I would lay my life down for her. We've been married for 46 years. But I will say this, if any of you were critical of my wife, you know, basically we'd go to blows, right? But I love her, and I am the only one that could have a critical opinion and still be loving. And so, and whether I'm quoting him correctly or not, but the idea is this: the church is Christ's bride, and we have no place to criticize someone else's bride and point out the flaws of someone else's bride that they love, that they sacrificed for, and that they cherish. And so it's not like, close your eyes, pretend like the church is perfect. But it's not our job to run around pointing out every wrinkle, gray hair, and So that just stuck with me on that analogy that he made is, no, we do need to honor the church, flaws and all, and realize it's not ours, it's Christ.
Yeah, because again, even in this scene, just pulling it back to the text, it's the Pharisees who are going to critique what? Those praising Jesus. So you can't equate the Pharisees with the church, because the church is praising Jesus. They're proclaiming him as the Messiah. As the Pharisees are saying, don't do that. And then Jesus rebukes them. And so we can't do that. We can't equate, see, Jesus talked to the Pharisees. He says he'd be talking to you guys. And no, actually he wouldn't be.
There are times I feel that, let me ask if you guys think this. There are times I feel like it's okay to be critical of the church, but the goal of that would be to heal like a doctor. The doctor has to tell you really cold facts like, okay, this looks bad. This looks ugly. You've got a wound here, and this needs to be fixed or somebody's going to die or be hurt.
But I will say too, like, to me, it's always wrong to group a whole race of people based on the actions of a person.
Yeah.
And so again, when you said it's okay to be critical of the church, now you're talking
I didn't say it was okay.
Little c,
global connection because of, so again, just like in premarital counseling when we talk about, stay focused on the issue at hand and not the person. Attack the problem, not the person. And
well, I think your motives have to be one of compassion and truth, not one of harm. And like, if I was to point out a flaw in someone else's wife, we'll all do this. It would be for a good reason. It wouldn't be because I have their disrespect or their shame involved. It would be something that I cared about them and I care about their relationship, right? So there are times, I think, as I just speak as a counselor, there are times you have to say things to other people's wives or husbands that they wouldn't tell them. And the only reason you would do that, though, is because you love them or care for them.
So I do think there is a place for people in their church to bring up issues that need to be dealt with in their church.
Right.
But those people ought to be participating in that church, and those people ought to be helping the solution of that church. There's
not deconstructing
there shouldn't be a stepping back and like, I hear like groups, other podcasts and different groups that'll say, even I get caught into this, like, the church, and they don't clarify, or pastors don't, and it's like if I was to obey everything everybody thinks a pastor should say,
oh boy,
there would be no room to talk about the Bible. Like, every issue would have to be covered. It's just like, so, and that's a problem. That's a problem. I think that it's easy to pick on. Those pastors, they do this wrong, and it's like, that's hasty generalization first and foremost. And we are the church. The people are the church. That's why I want to get away from like the building and the organization's not the church. This is the leadership that's trying to disciple and train. They're gifted Christians in the church trying to aid other Christians to be the disciples they can be, and that the more we can have that, and we're going to have different visions and different directions of what we think God's called that particular group of people to do. But really, again, it gets a little wonky in this whole conversation about what are we talking about? Who are we talking about?
I do fear when Christians who take it upon themselves to be more critical of the church in a means that makes them sound like they're not part of it anymore. In the guise of thinking that they're helping. So they'll start looking at the church as if they're no longer a member and say like, well, they do this, but I would never do that. And you're like, okay, we all do this as a church. We're all in this together. Mm-hmm. And so when my church does something or another or the church at large does something, we're all kind of participants in that. So I should be in favor of trying to have a conversation or get to the heart of the truth. But as soon as you separate yourself and say, I'm not them, that becomes difficult without some kind of doctrinal reason.
My wife had a friend who had gone off to some missions groups and come back, and she just struggled and would critique the church constantly about all these things. And she just finally looked at her and said, then why don't you go into the church and change it. If you know what you're talking about, if you know how to fix this. And immediately she was just like, she realized like, oh, I'm just being bitter. And that's the real thing. I don't want people to be bitter. I want, there is hurt in churches. Don't get me wrong. You've got fallen human beings gathering together in Christ and transformed by the Spirit. But we're here to try to proclaim him, and it's not going to go perfect. And there's a lot of false expectations we bring into this idea that we call church. And to be quite honest, I feel like it's better for us to just kind of set those aside and trust that the Lord is the King of the church, both big and little.
Preach.
Yeah, and that he's going to be the one who's going to be the one who rebukes and closes those churches down and challenges them. That doesn't mean that there isn't going to be people who rise up and say stuff, but it's got to come from those in the church that care about that local group of people that are part of the church globally, because that's not the case. And so anyway, there's so much more we could say about that, but I don't know how we got there from
the crowd.
Yeah, the crowd. And I will say too,
the crowd led us there.
My wife and I try to evaluate ourselves and our relationship frequently. And I know we just sat down and I told her, make a list of areas that I can improve. And she handed that to me. So I want to ask you guys to help keep me accountable to some of the changes I want to make. Because she said that I am, if she would appreciate it if I was less perfect, if I was less kind, patient, loving, and generous. And that's really going to be difficult for me, but I'm for her sake, I want to try.
We'll help.
So yeah.
I just feel like you might have hit your head on the way in.
Yeah, we were talking about as the church too. You were talking about that the attack that Jesus was making was on the Pharisees because they were trying to prevent him from worshiping him. And so that disconnect there. But again, when it comes to worshiping Jesus, you had mentioned in the service too that. Just our expression in worship as well. Being passionate in our worship. And there's people that struggle with that. Like, I'm just not a passionate person. I'm just not, that's not in my character. And I need to be authentic in my worship to God and be stoic. And so part of me is like, okay, if you won the lottery for $45 million, would you still be stoic? And so when you think about coming to worship God and everything that he has redeemed you from, how do we maintain being stoic in our expression of him? So again,
is that a comment, like a Facebook comment, or like one of the comments online, or is that a question? I'm just curious.
No, I'm trying to get to a question. So what do you think when we're talking about being more expressive in worshiping God? What do you think that means? Do you feel as though it's trying to unify your intellect and your heart, and try to get them aligned and intentional, or do you think it is just making happy faces and hand gestures?
So, yeah, I think that there is two sides of the problem. I think there is a thing called emotionalism, and that's what all these people who are stoic love to point to and go like, see, that's emotionalism. I don't want to be that way. And it's because emotionalism is having the emotions that you're being moved by the music and moved by the crowd and experience, but not having any thought about it. You're not, if you were to be asked like, hey, what does that mean that you were singing? They would literally sing heresy and be so passionate about the heresy they were singing. And that's not okay, right?
Which I have done numerous times because I sing lyrics wrong far too often. Oh. and then you just feel so guilty.
Well, Brent, when you're perfect and the way that you are, you're darn near God, right? I was just like, no.
There's a fine line.
I can excommunicate you now. But I think what the struggle for me is that like that's a cop-out to point to the far extreme of these people who aren't thinking about these words, because those people are pointing to what they would call the frozen chosen, this group of people who have no emotions at all, and yet they're singing these lofty, beautiful thoughts about the God who you should be passionate and excited about. And again, I think you're right. It's an integration of appropriate motions with the appropriate thinking. Like, you ought to know what you're singing, and you ought to know what that should feel like. And that's what I think we were joking because we were looking up the word praise, right, in the Bible, and then looking at the Greek and then looking at how they defined it. And it was sort of like to talk very wonderfully about, or whatever. It was like
expressively.
Not even, they didn't use the word expressive. It was just kind of positive, to say good things about God. And you're just like, or to, I agree, or it's like really nice. I just like was like, what are we talking about here? And that was driving me nuts. It's just like, oh yeah, to speak of the excellence of a person. Like, yes, but praise in the context we're looking at is loud and boisterous. I mean, literally says using loud words and loud voices, and so I do think that there is this just disconnect. Like, if you understand the words that what love means, and you love your wife, there's emotion there. If you love your friend, there's emotion there. If you love your dog, I've seen some people with more emotion for their dogs than they have during worship, and that's just sad. Like, oh, that's actually scary. That's very close to a Romans chapter 1 level. And so there is that tension I have between like do we just let people run around with flags in the auditorium and jump and shout and dance? And it's like, well, that's not our culture, but our culture is also not stand there, don't clap, fold your arms, and just, mumble the words along, or maybe you sing. And there's just going to be this like, there's going to be people who are more on the mental side and more on the emotional side. And I still even say more on the body. I think it's an integration of mind, heart, or mind, emotions, and body, because I don't think you can express emotions without the body truly moving. That's the essence of acting, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, you have to mimic your emotions typically will follow.
And so there's a direct correlation of the whole person. And so I'm moved more by my thoughts. Like, it begins with the words for me, and then I'm moved emotionally. And I have disciplined my body from embarrassment to, I bow when I say I'm going to bow in a song, or I will clap, or I will engage in lifting my hands if I say I'm raising my hands. And because for me, it's a commitment to, if I'm going to say it with my mouth, I'm going to do it. That's just kind of who I am. And it's helped my worship incredibly over the years. I think it's been, I'm a fairly expressive person with my hands anyway. So I think that needs to follow through in my worship. But there is some question out there that somebody's brought up, and Stephen, if you want to jump in on that, or Brent, you want to, it's that whole like, well, didn't Jesus and Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount say, if you're praying in public and people are seeing you, then you're getting your reward. Do what you're supposed to do in secret, right? Or you're giving.
Yeah, there are people who feel that, well, again, there's different expressions of worship from different denominational backgrounds too. And typically denominations are forged at a time where they're resisting some extreme on the other end that no longer exists now. But like, there was a time in which people were doing odd things in worship services. So some denominations said, well, we're not going to do that. And so they almost went the opposite direction. So this happens a lot of times in history, where you have more of your stoic movements of the church happening in response to somebody being over the top with their mystic beliefs or something. And so that's the big problem with churches in general, is the fact that at some points it is good to be, I think it's okay to be reverent, introspective. But I think that isn't the only thing that you see in scriptures. You do see times of doing that. The other thing is, I think people conflate these different concepts. We're talking about prayer in that section, and we don't pray like that anymore. This would be a public prayer that you wanted other people to see. God's like, no, you need to make your prayers more internal when you're praying. You're not praying to people, you're praying to me. So the context is important for that section. But it's hard for me to see that and not see Psalms, because when you're in the Gospels, you're still not in the church age completely. And so you still have a lot of Old Testament views on worship. And so when you see the words for worship, though, those words in the Old Testament often follow the idea that you do something physically. And so when to worship meant you would go in and make a full offering. Mm-hmm. That's an act of worship. That's a thing you do. You do this, you raise this calf, or you raise this thing up. It needs to be without blemish. You have to examine it. You have to bring it in. You have to do certain things. So that's a whole act in and of itself. And you're supposed to be thankful. There's supposed to be an act. There's actually an idea of bringing your thankfulness offering. But the other one is just like words for prayer, even in the Old Testament, typically follow words for bowing down. And so you're talking in your personal life, it would seem that the Bible would seem to indicate, at the very least, not always in your personal, that you should bow down when you pray, that the position of submission does something to your mental state. And so for me, it's important, at least I've tried to do this because I have really bad knees, especially when it comes to prayer at home in my private life, is to submit to the Lord, whether someone's there or not, by being in that position. And it has changed the way I psychologically feel. At first, it doesn't. After a while, you're like, this might be silly, or you might start hearing the voice in your head. But I do think there's something psychological when you do what the Bible asks you to do that changes your emotions. And I do feel like there's too many times I've read the Psalms where it says, like, raise your hands, shout, praise the Lord, make a new song. Now we're talking about being creative. And there are times where I don't really want to do those things, but I have to write down if some expressive joy comes to my heart where God did something and it's amazing, I need to write that down or I'm going to forget that. And that's kind of what the Psalms are saying. Like, hey, when these things are happening, remember your emotions and remember the posture of your body to show what you mean by them. And I think psychologically, what you want, I think what Greg said was true, you want to have your body, your mind, and your emotions aligned with truth. And if you have all of those things, at times they're going to be real expressive. Sometimes they may be real contemplative, but your emotions should fit what you're trying to do in that particular time in the worship. Like if you're talking about public worship, we're trying to get you to think a certain way that gears you into the message that prepares you to hear a truth about God. Sometimes the song itself is trying to get you to realize something about your God. And you may not be there yet, but at least you should try, because the song will say, you know, like, submit to the Lord. Like, well, how do I do that if I'm singing? I just sing that. Like, I have to do something. It's like, when do I do what it's telling me to do? If it's not in the service, do I go home and do that? Like, so you have to realize that the song is instructive and trying to teach you something about the Lord. And so you have to learn that lesson. So for me, as a thinker, what got me out of, and I'm still pretty stoic if you see me in the service, but I do try to raise my hands, is that I want to participate with other people so that we're all, like a crowd, feeling what we should be feeling that's appropriate. I can only do that in a safe environment because, like I said, with my history, I felt like there are many times people trying to rally my emotions to a falsehood. So a lot of times the first time I hear a song that I've never heard before, I'm actually evaluating the lyrics.
Absorbing it.
I want to hear what's the tone, what are they trying to get me to feel, what is the nature of the song, why are we singing it, is this really biblical? And I know that sounds like a higher thought, but like I think we all should do that in our worship. But once I get it, I should express it. Like if it's, especially if it's like, to me, there's a song that we sing that talks about the Trinity and the doctrine of the Trinity. That's an amazing thing, you know what I mean? Just to contemplate, to think about, to express my emotions towards, let my emotions go in a controlled state at least, but let them go and experience that and see if it doesn't make that truth more livable.
Yeah, and just kind of bring this full circle. I mean, the scriptures are clear. It directs our posture in prayer. It directs our posture in praise. And so again, going back full circle, we started out with sometimes Jesus will ask us to do something that is unreasonable or uncomfortable, and you know, being uncomfortable during worship for the right reasons is not a bad thing, and it will grow you.
And I think if people think that, like, oh no, I'm going to garner attention from my praise, it's like that's what praise does. I mean, these disciples were getting attention to praise Jesus. So yeah, they were getting attention, and it's the opposite of what Jesus actually said. Beware to practice your righteousness among men. And the point there was to gain a reputation for yourself of being a righteous person. But when you are praising something that is not you, that's different. You literally are getting the attention to be a reflection to God, which is why I don't think that appropriately connects to the concept of praise, adoration, shouts of thanksgiving, these kinds of things you would see in the Old Testament. There would be nowhere that you would read, don't do those. You're garnering it. This is about getting attention. Yeah. When you're supposed to be
You're
loud,
putting it on the right thing.
Get the attention so you can show people what the attention's towards.
And I mean, even Jesus did the miracles so that the Father would be glorified and recognized in that as well. So
real quick, the only other thing I want to say about this subject is this a good psychological kind of evaluation to say, what are the kinds of things in your life do you get excited for emotionally? What emotionally makes you physically move? And, and those are the things that often you need to be aware of. Is God one of those things? Like when a child is born, I remember my niece was born, everybody was emotionally excited. People were touching it. They're, oh my gosh, you did so wonderful. It's like all these emotions are coming out. That's family. You have a bond with somebody you don't even feel like you know quite yet. It's just all of the suffering and all that's very similar to worship. And so is it a ball game when you're like, oh my gosh, look, we're celebrating. And so there are these key moments of my life where I look back, because I am more stoic, to ask myself the question, when am I expressive? What gets me expressive? And is God one of those things? And why not? And do I need to do something to make it happen? But I do think it's good to be like, no matter, you watch if you were to record your expressive moments, how embarrassing it would be to probably look at them. But while you're experiencing them.
Oh, I have to do it all the time.
Yeah, because you're on the stage. But while you're experiencing them, you're like, man, but I don't think anyone would fault you for those things. I think they'd join you with them. So.
And I will say this, just a reminder, God invites us to worship him because it is what we need. God doesn't need you to worship him. You need to
God
worship.
To worship.
Yeah. And if you don't worship, the rocks will cry out. So God will be worshipped whether we're doing it or not. And I would just like to be on the inside of that part. But I think that kind of wraps up this. But we have one more question. And it comes from Nate.
We got one on the
and it
line
was kind
too.
of interesting. And it's what?
We got the one online too.
We do. I didn't see one in the email thing today.
No, on the YouTube.
Oh. So Nate asked this. He says, if God made us to be fruitful and multiply, then why is he taking that away in the new world? If it's a perfect world, when we're in heaven, wouldn't newborn children be born in a world without sin? And then kind of a caveat, would that be unjust to those who had to endure life here on earth? But there's an interesting question. If when we were created for a purpose, go forth and multiply, and then he takes that away from us in eternity.
So I guess the first thing is to indicate that this is a command with an endpoint. Be fruitful, fill the earth, subdue it. That end point will be hit when God deems that we've filled the earth and subdued it, and therefore there's no need to have any more people. That command has been reached, and I believe that that's first and foremost. This is just as the replacement, not replacement, but the New Testament version, which is, go make disciples of all the nations. That too has an end point. We won't be evangelizing in eternity either.
And both of them have the same purpose, which is to populate the kingdom of heaven.
Right. But they actually call that the first Great Commission is to be fruitful and multiply. It's often called the Great.
The best way to produce
new disciples.
You make was to make them, and discipleship was a family thing.
Still going on to this day. Yeah, it's still a thing.
We're called a family as a church more than anything else. It's a family. And so, it's so when you get to eternity and that stops, it's like, oh, no little kids. That's kind of, but really, there are a bunch of little kids still around here. Like we are all in the spans of eternity, little kids in a very real way. And we don't know what our bodies are going to be like and feel like and look like once we're fully and completely resurrected, in the sense that you have that almost like, I like how Tolkien describes the elves as being like, looking so youthful and yet having this, sense of aged eternity behind them. There's something about that you're gonna be a childlike person. There's also questions of like all these children who are aborted, all these children who are frozen embryos. Like, are they gonna have a chance? If Christ's blood has covered them and they're in a state of innocence or something like that, which is a viewpoint. Well, what kind of bodies will they have in the resurrection? Will they have instantaneous, 33-year-old or whatever it is bodies, or are they going to have child bodies that grow into that maturity and that adulthood? That's a question people have asked. So we don't know. But
the other part of that particular commission is the fact that it's be fruitful and multiply does mean make children, but it also means bring things under God's rule and to use them appropriately. And even in the new earth, I think there are things to create in that sense, and there'll be more things to explore that we haven't reached yet. So being fruitful would be produce more goods. And so in that sense, it's ongoing even in the kingdom of heaven, that we are still going to learn new music, do wonderful things, make new crafts, new technologies, new places to look for.
Great new stories.
Yeah, and so there's still a fruitfulness of increasing that goodness in number. So that's also part of that early commission. So because they were supposed to make everything part of the garden. Not everything was the garden. So.
All right, and you said there was one more question. I didn't see it.
Well, there's a question from online from back when we were
talking about slavery.
Yeah, we had a 101 podcast 109. We talked a lot about slavery, but there was one individual, Bugsy0333, on our YouTube channel, and please be polite to him. But he did put a form of a question here. He did ask it twice. And his question was, after listening to whatever portion that he listened to, was, I wonder if you can tell me when one person owning another person as their property would be acceptable. So that's his question. So thank you for the question. But it came out of our conversation about slavery.
Yeah, and again, I think that when we think in moral absolutes, the answer is like there's no real moral when one person owning another person as property, since that was the question. I don't think there's a moral situation in which you should own anyone as property. It's devaluing them as the image of God. It's not a property question. It's a question about the idea of people being valued. Now, if you're in a state in which you can own people because of the world that you live in, again, it's how are you treating that person, not treating them as property. And so, because persons do own persons, just put the bald fact out there that God owns everything, right? That's all his. He owns us, whether we like it or not. We are his, and he is, but he doesn't treat us as his property, like in some kind of sense of like some generic stuff. There's some definitional terms that I would want to ask questions about in that, like, what are you getting at by the word property? What do you mean? Because property can have several different shades of definition there. It's not just a clear sense of like, I own them, like what? Like you own an animal, like you own like a car. I mean, I know people who treat cars really well and treat their animals really well and yet treat people really horribly and they don't own them. It's this, I don't know how much God concerned himself with ownership words as much as he cared about, I don't care what that situation is. I care about how you treat the person.
Yeah, no.
I care about how you treat them as the image of God.
Stewardship and a responsibility for.
But if he's saying like I have right completely over you as a human, etc., and I get to do whatever I want because you're my property, that's not a. I don't believe that's a morally acceptable position if in the sense of what we're talking about. Right. However, in God's working with a fallen human world, he does allow the human standards to be that we've created to be there, and he does the best he can to right them and direct them toward the good.
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because I do feel like there is some category errors here. It depends on how you're hearing the word property to me. So can you tell me when one person owning another person as their property would be acceptable? It wouldn't be acceptable if you're thinking like we think now, in the sense that I have a car and it's mine, I could do whatever I want. I have autonomy over this person. They have no autonomy of their own. I own their autonomy or something like that. Then no, I don't even think the Bible would be saying that. I actually think the Bible is saying, like, because the word worker and the word slave are the same word, there's no different word. If you work for someone under contract and they take care of you, in that world they called that a slave. We think of a slave as someone who's owned by another because of chattel slavery, because that was what they were doing. And the Bible would expressly forbid that. Not only that, in the ancient world, that would have been okay to do that. Other people weren't considered human at all. they were your property and were thought of as cattle in their law system.
And God is not endorsing that.
No, that's what I'm saying. So the weird thing about the ancient world is this concept does not exist in the Bible. This is what I'm saying when we had our conversation, that the Bible is so unique in its concept that it actually comes up with the idea of human rights by saying that just because someone's under contract and you control a large portion of their freedoms, they are still a human being and they're created in the image of God, and you cannot disrespect them, because if you do so, I'm angry at you. That concept of God being angry at you because of the way you treat people is unique to the Bible. I can't find anywhere else in the ancient world where people thought of that and people in that condition. Nope. So I'm not embarrassed by this at all. When you read it like a modern person that says, oh, slavery, chattel slavery is owning someone, then you would hear that wrong. But if you were in the ancient world and people had nowhere to live, and the only way to live was to beg someone else to take you in, and the guy's like, okay, I'm going to put you under contract for 7 years. You're going to work for me. I'm going to treat you like a human being created in the image of God. And then when you're done, I'm going to release you after 7 years. We're called that slavery, is not what we call slavery in the modern world. So if you there's a concept error here. So really put yourself in the ancient world. And doesn't mean that there weren't abuses going on, but I think
it's an error called
that's what
equivocation.
You're saying. Yeah.
Like you're equivocating on the word slave.
Yeah.
The word that you think it means from our modern context, the word that they meant in the ancient context. And if you think you get to say what they meant, that's not how you read texts. That's not how. In fact, then I get to say what you think, right? So we don't want to play that game.
Yeah, no, and I don't know where people are coming at, but there are enough people who do feel that way, right? Who do feel like, how dare you? And I'm saying that the reason why you're frustrated and you see that as an evil, which is a good thing in my mind. It's good to see slavery in the way you're looking at it as evil. It comes from the biblical concept. The idea that someone is a human being and can't be their autonomy and their free will taken away and controlled like an animal, that is wrong. That comes from your biblical concept of humanity being created in the image of God. And whether you attribute it to God or not, the idea of human rights comes from all men being created equal. That concept is a biblical concept.
From the image of God.
From the image of God. And so I'm saying that you should feel rightfully outraged when someone says it's okay to own someone as property in the way that they did in the South. But I'm saying that that's not quite what the Bible is saying.
And I mean, on the other side too, I mean, this was often an economic situation where they either couldn't provide for themselves, so therefore somebody provided for them in exchange for them working their land or whatever. And so,
at least in the Old Testament,
you can't equivocate Roman and Greek slavery with Hebrew.
And we did that in 109. We went through that really well.
Be real careful. Those are the word slavery. Don't allow it to shift around on you.
Yeah.
Don't put Southern slavery into the Roman time period, and don't put that slavery into the Hebrew time. The biblical Hebrew concept. The New Testament's talking about Roman slavery, but it's not endorsing Roman slavery. It's just saying this is kind of what is, and Roman slavery didn't have any. There was no other way to think about it because they didn't exist in free markets or concepts or any of that kind of stuff. So, so that's what you were saying, Brent. So
yeah, and I mean, and just kind of, just to throw out another controversial discussion that we don't have time for right now is, in that idea of it being, I can't fend for my family, therefore I'm indentured to somebody else that's going to provide for my family, or I'm indebted to somebody, I have no means to pay that debt off, and therefore I'm going to work for you. And nowadays too, there wasn't a government that just said, okay, you just live in your own house and we'll just take care of your family. I mean, the Bible also says if you don't work, you don't eat. And so again, when you look at, some of the systems that we have in our government, in our culture today, there are better solutions. And, and either way you go, people are taking advantage of and abusing the systems and abusing one another, and none of that.
And that happened back then.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So I think that kind of ties it up, and and so we are going to wish you all a very happy Easter.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
He is risen.
He is risen indeed.
And we will see you this weekend.
All right. So, hey, thanks for joining us. We hope that you will let us know if you got any further follow-up questions, and we'll see you this weekend. So let us know. You can drop us a line at rabbittrail@obcc.church. That's rabbittrail@obcc.church. And indeed, may God bless your Easter.
Check it out.
God bless.